finally gathering together on the church property for the first time since March, 5 months ago, and yet we'll keep doing the video messages for those that can't be there. But we're happy to be together again. And so today, as we kind of pick up where we left off last message, the formula for forgiveness, that God is in control, that He cares about us, that He will deal with our enemies. Romans 12:19 says, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay.'" And the book of Esther is a powerful testimony to that fact. God's able to deal with those who come against us much more effectively than we are. The book of Esther also gives a warning about being bitter. One of the most bitter people in the whole Bible is Haman, and we will learn that we don't want to be like him. So let's take a look in the book of Esther today. This, by the way, this is a book that is filled with coincidences. Amazing how things work together. It seems like something Shakespeare would have had to invent, but I've seen so many coincidences in my life that it's not hard for me to believe that these are actual historical occurrences, and that God is working today even as He was back in those days. Coincidences in our lives, we keep running into somebody, or we get a phone call from somebody just when we were thinking of them, or we call somebody and they say, "I was just thinking about you," and we wonder, was that just an accident, just a random happening, or was God involved in that and somehow? Somebody has said that coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous. We're not quite sure if God is behind that or not, but we suspect, and if you're a person of faith, it's not easy, it's not hard to believe that yes, God was. And so today, as we look into this book of Esther, we want to consider the fact there are no mentions of the name of God in the whole book. He's anonymous. You wonder, it never says that God caused this to happen or that to happen, but most likely the book of Esther doesn't include the name of God because it shows how God works behind the scenes. In our lives, He does the same thing. God is always active in Esther, and so it is in our lives. And we call them coincidences. I think we could call them God-created incidents many times. So chapter 2, verse 7 of the book of Esther, and may God open our hearts to His truth today. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So here they are, exiled in a strange land. Esther's parents have died, and she may have wondered, is there any meaning to what's going on here? Is it just chance? Is it just blind fate? Well, she was about to find out that it was far from that. God foresaw that there was going to come an attempt to exterminate His chosen people, the Jews, and He needed somebody in a position of influence to intercede in their behalf before the king. And so through all these things, we won't tell the story. You can read it yourself if you want to again, but she became the queen. Contest was arranged, and she was chosen. Coincidental that God needed somebody to be the queen, and here was this beautiful girl that just was able to fulfill the God's plan. And so she was now the queen. Mordecai was still in contact with her, not directly, but through intermediaries probably. And while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, it says in Esther 2:21, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Very significant, quite a coincidence here. What a coincidence that Mordecai became aware of this and was able to report it, and we'll see how that comes into play later on. By the way, when it mentions that they were impaled on poles, some translations talk about being hung on gallows. The original word there talks about a wooden device of some sort, and could have been a gallows. The NIV, which we're reading from, indicates that it was a pole on which people were impaled. A cruel, torturous way to die. But the fact is that God, in amazing coincidence, had Mordecai aware of what was going on and got word to the king. Now, the number 2 man in the kingdom was a wicked man named Haman, the Agagite. He may have been a descendant of Agag, the wicked king of the Amalekites, whom Saul failed to destroy. But he was a descendant of Agag, and Mordecai was a descendant of the Jews. And in Esther 3:5, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. One commentator says, no self-respecting Jew would bow before a descendant of the ancient Amalekite enemy of the Jews. It was not just disrespect for a position, but that person in that position was an outright enemy. And Haman said, or Mordecai said, I'm not going to bow before Haman. It caused him a great deal of danger, put him in jeopardy. But he said, I'm going to honor God and obey him rather than honor this man who is directly opposed to everything that God represents. And so it would be fascinating to see all the coincidences that come into our lives that God places there, but also there are coincidences where Satan places people, circumstances into our lives. I'm very aware that we have an opponent who brings obstacles and temptations across my path in ways that are far beyond just random chance. Anybody else ever notice that? Satan knows our frailties and our fears, and he zeroes in on them. How interesting it is that of all 127 provinces under the rule of King Xerxes, that Satan had arranged apparently to have a man put in second place to him, right next to him in power in the kingdom, a man who was this enemy of the Jews, a man that was a descendant of Israel's, some of their worst enemies. What a coincidence. Well, not a coincidence probably, as random chance would have it, but that there is an enemy that works those coincidences also. Sometimes think of my life as a chessboard and the pieces that are being moved around on it. The world champion Grand Master is God, but Satan is the junior Grand Master, the challenger. He's always plotting ways to take us down. Now the Bible says we're not ignorant of Satan's schemes, but he doesn't know the future. God does. God has plans for us. He's moving the pieces on the board towards an intended purpose, to give us a future and a hope. He's always moving the pieces in such a way as to protect us and direct us into his ultimate purpose. And we just see the immediate move on the board, and sometimes it makes no sense at all. Esther as a child may have wondered, why did my parents die? Why were my people carried captive, uprooted, and here we are in this strange land? But God, the Grand Master, sees the big picture. His strategies are as high above ours as the heavens are above the earth. Now, Satan is sly, he's crafty, he's cunning. But even his ways, God's ways are as high above his as the heavens are above the earth. And so we don't need to second guess God, we just need to trust him. The book of Esther reveals that even when I don't see it, he's working. Even when I don't feel it, he's working. And so Satan had on his board this important piece, a person named Haman, that Satan was trying to move around and bring to promote the destruction of God's people. Let's pick it up, Esther 3:6. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Now, the same spirit that had motivated Pharaoh to want to kill the infant boys of the Hebrews, God's chosen people, the same spirit that motivated Hitler to want to kill all the Jews, was on full display right here in the book of Esther. And so we pick up in verse 8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed among the people in the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the best interests of the king to tolerate them. Now, that wasn't true. They were dangerous, but Haman made it sound that way, and he said, if it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. He was so bitter, he was willing to pay any price, although it would probably come off the estates of the Jews that he was planning to murder, that he would pay that. But when we're bitter, we want to get somebody no matter what it costs. Well, King Xerxes authorized the decree. He sent out to all 127 provinces, and then word finally got back to Esther. Mordecai sent word to her, and this is what he said. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? He said, Esther, it's not just a coincidence that you're where you are. You have a chance to have a voice, to speak to the king. It's not just a coincidence. It's a God-created incident. It's a God incident. And God is going to use you for such a time as this. You know, wherever you are right now, God has a purpose for it. It may be a long-term purpose, it may be short-term, it may be a big thing, it may be a small thing, but you're there for such a time as this. Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. I am going to move ahead with what I think God has placed me here to do. I'm in a position that God has placed me in, but that doesn't mean it's just going to be easy or that I'm not going to depend on Him. I very much depend on Him. I see myself in positions where I really need God's help to realize the purpose that He's set me there for. So she went in, and the king, who was a man of vile temper and could have just easily had her killed in an instant, he accepted her approach to enter and visit with him. And she gave him a dinner invitation, which Haman also was invited to. She didn't tell the king what was on her heart yet when they had dinner. But she asked him and Haman to dinner again the next night. And Haman was thrilled. He bragged to his wife, Esther 5:12. And that's not all, Haman added. I am the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the gate. Haman's problem was not Mordecai. It was the emptiness in his own heart. Even if he solved the Mordecai problem, it wouldn't fill the emptiness in his own heart. We all have a hunger to be recognized, to be appreciated, to be valued. There will always be people who reject us. But we can be happy anyhow if we realize that we're accepted by the only one whose opinion really matters, and that someone is God. Haman's deep-seated insecurities meant that he could never be happy. He craved honor Haman, but he couldn't, or from Mordecai, but it wasn't going to happen. And it leads to one of the most tragic personal endings in the whole Bible. Esther 5:14. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching to the height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. That's 70 feet high, is about 2.5 times higher than the light poles out in our church parking lot. He wanted it that high, somebody has said, because the palace was built on a hill and it was like 45 feet high. And this way, if he just looked out, straight out, he'd get a look to see his enemy Mordecai impaled on that pole. And as he's eating his dinner, just rejoice at what he's seeing there, because bitterness makes you so sour. It makes you cruel. The way that, according to Clark's commentary, a person was impaled on a pole in those days, the appointed stake is set upright in the ground, and the culprit is taken, placed on the sharp point, and then pulled down by his legs till the stake that went in at the fundament, the crotch area, passes up through the body and comes out through the neck. A most dreadful species of punishment in which revenge and cruelty may glut the utmost of their malice. The culprit lives a considerable time in excruciating agonies. That's what bitterness causes you to want to see happen. And it's a cruel thing. Don't let it grow in your heart. It'll poison your whole life. It'll make you a sour, negative person. James 3:11 says, "Does a fountain send forth at the same time sweet water and bitter?" A warning against allowing anything in our life like that. And as this story will show soon, it can destroy both you and those that you love. Well, Esther 6:1, that same night of the banquet, the same night that Haman talked to his wife, it says that same night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. What a coincidence. Where it was found, where the book opened up to, it was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate him. "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. What a coincidence. Haman is thinking about Mordecai. The king is thinking about Mordecai, except their ideas about what was going to happen to him were quite different, but how all these events intersected, it was God's coincidence. And so when Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man who the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe so that the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.' Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Well, that wasn't quite what Mordecai had in mind, and he probably didn't continue his conversation about impaling Mordecai on a pole. He got the robe and the horse, and he robed Mordecai, and he led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Now the king himself probably wasn't even aware that the Jews were the object of his edict, because he describes Mordecai the Jew here. Sometimes people that are in our lives don't really recognize or pay that much attention to the details and their unfair judgments and all kinds of things, but God knows, God sees, and God will take care of you ultimately. So as Haman is totally humiliated, remember, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. He still has no idea that the queen of the whole realm is Jewish, but he shows up that night for the second banquet. And in the midst of that, Esther details the plot against her people and then identifies Haman as the instigator, the one behind it all. Well, that did not set well with the king. As we know, he was a man given to temper. And it says in Esther 7:7, the king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. He was done for. What a coincidence. He just happened to fall onto the couch as the king was coming in. According to Jewish legend, it was the angel Gabriel that pushed him. But be that as it may, he was over. His life was over. He was done. Verse 9, then Harbon, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, a pole reaching up to a height of 50 cubits stand by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, impale him on it. What a coincidence. I was just wanting to kill Haman anyhow, and here's a pole for me to do it. Now, this was obviously not a man you want to upset, which helps us understand Esther's concern about approaching him in the first place. But she had gone, and God had given her favor and grace. Now, Haman, the disturbed man who seemingly had achieved everything, he ended up with nothing, not even a financial estate to pass on to his family. Esther 8:1 says, the same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemies of the Jews. Think how hard he had worked to achieve it all. It was all for nothing, just for a waste, and we need to examine our lives. What are we focused on? And what is our life goal? And are we here living for ourselves or for God, for His people and other people to come to know Him? Well, the later part of verse 1 says, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. So Haman had everything, but he lost it all because of bitterness. Instead of being thankful for all that he had, he focused on the few things that he lacked. And God will repay your enemies. God will repay you for your faithfulness to Him. Not always in this life, but often it is. And now the decree still stood, though. It was still in effect. It couldn't be rescinded even by the king himself, so he announced another law to counteract the first one. Esther 8:11, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, to plunder the property of their enemies. And verse 17, in every province, in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because the fear of the Jews had seized them. So God turned this around and reversed the curse. And just as Haman was impaled on his own pole, the the enemies of the Jews that had been against them, they actually became Jews themselves because they saw the glory of God and the power and the favor that they had. And so it's usually not a great idea to go to war against the Jews. There was still this edict in place which gave them permission, but it also gave permission for them to fight back. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan gathered their armies against Israel in 1967. And when the Six-Day War was over, 90% of the Egyptian Air Force was wiped out sitting on the ground. The holdings of Israel, land holdings, were tripled. Arab casualties were more than 10 times greater than those suffered by Israel. And something like that happened here. In the days when this edict was come to pass, the same day that they were given the permission to murder the Jews were also given permission to defend and annihilate anybody that came against them. And 75,000 enemies of the Jews died that day. Instead of it being the darkest day in Jewish history, it became a festive holiday in remembrance of God's provision. And we may talk about that more next time, how Calvary is a picture of that. The darkest day became the day of the greatest victory. But instead of being wiped out, God's chosen people actually increased in numbers. I want to remind you here, bitterness affects your family. Haman's entire material estate was seized upon his death, and apparently his sons were so filled with a resentment that they joined in attacking the Jews on that day of the intended slaughter. We read of the Jews killing 500 attackers in the capital city of Susa. But Esther 9:7 says they also killed Parshandatha, and there's a list I'm not going to read. It says these were the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. There were 10 months from the time that Haman died and the decree came into fulfillment, the day of slaughter. They had 10 months, those sons, to stew in their resentment, to percolate in their pain, and to get mad at God over the loss of their family estate, get mad at God over what happened to their dad. By the way, be careful when you start accusing God of wrongdoing. The next book after Esther in our Bible is the book of Job, and it exposes the smallness of our perspective compared to God's viewpoint. These 10 sons, they actually could have become Jews. They could have said, wow, if there's a God that is that powerful, that works things in that way, then we want to serve him. But instead they went the opposite way. They turned against God even more, and the Jews, God would have accepted them. He has no delight in the death of the wicked. But Haman's legacy of bitterness was carried on in his son with devastating results. Each one of those. Dalphon, God could have had a good plan, a purpose that he could have used, and all 9 of the other sons as well, but they let bitterness get in the way, and it resulted in their own literal physical deaths. Would you let God deal with the difficult people in your life instead of trying to do it on your own? Are you going to go out and try and slay people when maybe God's better able to deal with them? Will you trust God in the dark times? Will you let God use you to provide a God incident in somebody else's life? God brings coincidences to point people towards himself. The result of all the coincidences in the book of Esther is that many people of other nationalities became Jews. That's what the Bible says. They became part of the people of God because God was working and they were able to see that. And that's what God-ordained coincidences are for, to remind us that God is in control, that he's involved in our lives, that he cares for us, and that he cares for other people. God uses coincidences to intersect our lives with the lives of other people. One of those people that my life intersected, I'd like to just kind of finish up with a personal story today, the coincidences of God in regard to my friend Donnie Dunn. Now, Donnie was a guy I knew of. He grew up in Granger. I grew up in Zilla, 5 miles away. His dad, Buddy Dunn, was the pastor there, and I maybe had met him a time or two, but the first time my life really intersected in a meaningful way was one Sunday morning when he showed up in our church with his guitar in hand and said, "Hey, here I am. I'm on your worship team." He had been working, phlebotomist, Dracula as he called himself, draws blood from people's veins for the medical clinic. And Angie had invited him to come to church, and he showed up. And it was, what a coincidence that he just showed up that day. He worked with somebody from our church, and he just fit in. He became an integral part, so loved in our church, became a board member, and we loved Donnie. Pete Cole on our worship team of the church happened to have a group he called Thirst No More. And Pete and Donnie hit it off. Eventually, Donnie became a part of Pete's group was called Homeward Bound. Thirst No More was the offshoot of that, which Donnie became a part of. But what a coincidence that we had people in our church that were just the right people at the right time for him to meet up with, and they met up with him, and it was a beautiful thing. And Donnie eventually he felt directed to go elsewhere, and I kind of lost touch with him until one day, just this last March, I happened in God's coincidence, God's incident timing. I happened to be visiting Mary from our church in the hospital, and Mary's daughter Cheryl happened to come in, and she said that her daughter had happened to see an ambulance there at Donnie's house, and that he had been taken to the hospital. And so I went down to the emergency room and found out he had suffered the rupture of an artery, main artery of his heart, and it was not survivable. But I was able to be there for maybe an hour before Donnie passed away, able to be with his family and friends and loved ones, able to be, by God's coincidence, in a place where I could minister. I was there probably for an hour after Donnie passed away. But here's a guy that I hadn't talked closely with probably in a couple of years. I would have felt so bad if I just heard from a distance that Donnie had passed away, but God allowed me to be there because God cared about me as much as he cared about Donnie. God knew I needed to be there, and there were people that needed me to be there. I just happened to be in the hospital, and it just happened that a series of events that I found out that he was there and was able to go and be a part of it. Some people probably thought, well, I'd heard and somebody had asked me to go. That wasn't the case. Some people might have thought, well, you're a spiritual man, just led of the Spirit. You must have sensed the Spirit saying, why don't you go to the hospital now? But that wasn't it at all. It was just that God intervened. It was the last week before the hospitals were closed down from visitors because of the COVID virus. Another 3 days, and I wouldn't have been able to be there in the room. But God ordains, God is involved in our lives. God cares about us, and we need to embrace and recognize that God created coincidences in our lives. Accept them as a sign to us that God cares about us and that he cares about other people. He wants to use me to touch other people. He's going to use coincidences. And so, Father, today, I pray that you would help us not to be bitter, but to be sweet. Help us not to be like Haman, but to be like Esther instead. In Jesus' name, amen.